The snow around the wreckage was still red when General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst gave the order that turned a military disaster into an execution ground. It was November of 1942, on the frozen coast of southern Norway, and the commander of all German forces in the country stood over the survivors of two crashed British gliders, men with broken backs and shattered legs, who had surrendered under the laws of war. Falkenhorst invoked Hitler's Commando order, a secret directive that stripped captured raiders of every protection, and within days the wounded were shot in the back of the head, injected with air bubbles by a Gestapo doctor, or strangled in cells, their bodies dumped in unmarked ground. 34 hours earlier, those men had been the Allies' best hope of stopping the German atomic bomb. They had been aimed at a single building in a frozen gorge, a hydroelectric plant called Vemork, perched on a shelf of rock above the town of Arjuken in southern Norway. Inside its basement, 18 steel cells were quietly concentrating the rarest industrial substance on Earth, a liquid called heavy water. And heavy water was the moderator the German nuclear program needed to breed the fuel for a functioning atomic weapon. The two gliders carrying 34 British engineers had gone down in storm and darkness, one into a mountainside, one into a fjordside slope, and now every survivor was dead. Falkenhorst inspected the target they had died trying to reach, walked its floors, studied its approaches, and ordered it transformed. Minefields went into the hillsides, floodlights went up on the roofs, machine gun positions covered the single suspension bridge that crossed the gorge, and garrison troops moved into barracks beside the electrolysis building itself. The general examined the maps of southern Norway, concluded that the British would come again, and prepared Vemork to kill them when they did. 400 miles away, in a training camp in the Scottish Highlands, a 23-year-old Norwegian named Joachim Ronneberg was handed the mission that had just annihilated 34 trained soldiers. Ronneberg was not a career officer. He was a young man from the coastal town of Alesund who had escaped occupied Norway in an open fishing boat and volunteered for a British-run special forces unit called Norwegian Independent Company No. 1, known to its men as Compani Lynch. He held no combat record. He had never fired a shot at a German soldier. What he possessed was something the planners in London had learned at terrible cost that they could not do without. He had grown up on skis in Norwegian winter, in the kind of terrain that had already killed more Englishmen than the enemy had. The British staff abandoned the idea of gliders, abandoned the idea of engineers, and gave Ronneberg permission to handpick 5 men from the Lynch ranks for a mission the files named Operation Gunnerside. 6 men would be dropped by parachute onto the Hardangervidda, the largest barren mountain plateau in northern Europe, in the middle of winter. They would carry everything on their backs. They would link up with an advance team that was already out there, somewhere in that white desert, and they would walk into the most heavily defended industrial site in Norway and destroy the heavy water cells by hand. The advance team was the mission's first miracle, because by any reasonable measure, its 4 members should already have been dead. They were codenamed Grouse, 4 Norwegians under a 24-year-old lieutenant named Jens Anton Paulsen, and they had parachuted onto the plateau back in October of 1942 to guide the doomed glider force in. When the gliders crashed, London ordered Paulsen's men to stay put and wait for a second attempt, and so 4 soldiers spent the darkest months of the Norwegian winter alone on the Hardangervidda, with no resupply, no relief, and rations that ran out almost immediately. Temperatures on the plateau fell far below zero. Storms pinned them inside a plank hut for days at a time, while wind stripped the heat from the walls. The men scraped reindeer moss from beneath the snow and boiled it. Their bodies consumed their own muscle. By December, they were skeletal, feverish, and hallucinating from malnutrition. And then Paulsen tracked a herd of wild reindeer across the ice and shot one, and the 4 of them survived the way their ancestors had, eating the meat, the marrow, the blood, and the half-digested moss inside the animal's stomach, which contained the vitamins that were keeping scurvy from finishing them off. They were still out there, still transmitting weather reports on a failing radio, when Ronneberg's 6-man team finally boarded a Halifax bomber in England on the night of February 16, 1943. The drop itself nearly scattered the mission across the mountains. Cloud and wind pushed the aircraft off its mark, and the 6 men and 11 supply containers came down miles from the intended zone, onto a stretch of the plateau none of them recognized. Within hours, a storm rose off the ice caps, a full harbinger of a blizzard, wind strong enough to knock a standing man off his feet, and visibility measured in arm lengths. The team crawled into an abandoned hunting cabin, and the weather sealed the door for 5 consecutive days. When the sky finally broke, they dug their containers out of the drift, loaded packs weighing more than 65 pounds apiece, and began hauling explosives across the roof of Norway, toward a rendezvous point they could locate only by map bearing and instinct. On the 23rd of February, a figure appeared on the white horizon, bearded, hollow-cheeked, moving on skis with the mechanical economy of a man rationing his last calories. It was one of Paulsson's starved scouts. The advance party and the assault party met in the snow, 10 men now, and the emaciated grouse team briefed Ronneberg on what 4 months of watching had taught them about the fortress below. The picture was worse than London had promised. Vemork sat on a ledge of rock partway up the wall of a gorge so steep that the sun never reached the valley floor in winter. On one side of the plant, the mountain rose sheer above it, laced with German mines and tripwires after Falkenhorst's inspection. The only formal approach was the suspension bridge, 75 feet of open steel above a 200-foot drop, guarded around the clock, covered by automatic weapons, and lit. Behind the plant, a penstock of massive pipes climbed the mountain under guard patrols. Every reasonable route into the target had been anticipated, fortified, and pre-sighted, because the Germans had studied the same maps the British had and reached the same conclusions. That left only the unreasonable route. It left the gorge itself, a descent of nearly 600 feet down an ice-glazed rock face, a crossing of the half-frozen river at the bottom, and then a climb of roughly 500 vertical feet up the far wall to a narrow railway ledge that ran along the mountainside into the plant's rear yard. The Germans had left the gorge, essentially unguarded for the simple reason that their engineers had judged it impossible to climb in winter. Paulsson's local knowledge said otherwise. Barely. One of the team had studied aerial photographs and spotted stunted birch and juniper growing out of the far wall, and where trees could root, a man could find handholds. It was not a plan so much as a wager. 10 men, carrying submachine guns, pistols, grenades, and enough plastic explosive to shatter 18 steel cells, would climb down into a frozen ravine at night, cross a river swollen with early melt, and free climb an ice-covered cliff directly beneath the garrison in silence, with numb hands. If any man fell, the mission's orders were explicit and absolute. No one would stop for him. And the orders went further, into territory the men discussed only once. Each of them carried a rubber-coated capsule of potassium cyanide. If capture became certain, they were expected to use it, because every man had seen the intelligence reports about what Falkenhorst's commando order had done to the glider survivors, and every man understood that surrender at Vemork was simply a slower way to die. On the night of February 27, 1943, the 10 men skied down off the plateau in the dark and stopped at the lip of the gorge. Below them, across the black gap, the plant hummed. Vemork was never silent. Its generators ran day and night, a low industrial roar that filled the ravine and covered small sounds, the one gift the target gave its attackers. The floodlights burned along the bridge. Somewhere inside the fence compound, sentries walked their circuits on packed snow, and in the basement of the 8-story electrolysis building, the 18 cells went on dripping their concentrated product into steel canisters, drop by drop, toward the German laboratories waiting in Berlin. The team cached their skis and reserve gear in the snow, checked weapons wrapped against the cold, and Ronneberg divided them for the assault. A covering party of 5 under Knut Haukelid, whose job was to take position near the German barracks and kill the garrison's response if the alarm sounded, and a demolition party of 4, led by Ronneberg himself, whose job was to reach the basement and lay the charges. Every man synchronized on the plan's most unforgiving detail. If firing started, there would be no retreat across the gorge, and the fight would end in the compound one way or the other. Then they went over the edge. The descent was a controlled fall through birch scrub and rock, boots punching through crust, 60-pound loads dragging them toward the river faster than any of them wanted to move. At the bottom, they found the next complication already waiting. A thaw had come early that week, and the river ice that Paulsson's scouts had reported as solid was rotten, sagging and moving. A single narrow bridge of ice remained intact between the banks, water running visibly over parts of it, and the 10 men crossed it one at a time in the dark, listening to it crack under their weight, knowing that the same thaw would be working on it for the next several hours, and that their only path home was dissolving behind them as they climbed. On the far side, the wall went up into the night, 500 feet of frost-slick rock and frozen juniper roots, and the men slung their weapons, stripped off their mittens where the holds demanded bare skin, and started up toward the ledge, toward the humming plant, toward the garrison that did not yet know they existed. High above them, the railway gate into the rear of the Vemork compound stood chained. Beyond it, less than 100 yards away, German soldiers sat in a heated barracks with their weapons racked. And in the basement of the main building, one Norwegian night shift caretaker sat alone beside the 18 cells, unaware that the war's most consequential commando raid was climbing out of the gorge beneath his feet. The last man pulled himself over the lip of the ledge just before midnight, and for a full minute the 10 of them lay flat on the railway line, chests heaving, listening to the plant roar into the dark. No searchlight moved. No sentry called out. The generator's thunder had swallowed every scrape of boot and rifle sling on the climb, and now that same thunder lay between the raiders and the garrison like a curtain. 500 feet below, the river was already eating the ice bridge they had crossed. There was one direction left, and it ran forward along the narrow rail ledge, toward the chained gate of the most heavily defended building in Norway. They advanced in single file with weapons up, hugging the mountainside of the tracks, and stopped in the shadow of a small shed within sight of the compound fence. Ahead, the floodlit yard was empty. The German guards had learned what the raiders were counting on, that patrolling open ground in a Norwegian February was misery, and that no attack could possibly come out of the gorge. The sentries kept to the bridge and the warmth of the barracks hut, and their confidence had been arranged for them by their own engineers, who had certified the ravine unclimbable. At midnight the guard changed. The team watched the relief walk its short circuit and disappear, and then Hawkelid's covering party moved first, bolt cutters opening the chain on the railway gate in 2 quiet bites. 5 men flowed through and took positions in the shadows facing the barracks door, submachine guns leveled, grenades laid out on the snow within reach. If that door opened at the wrong moment, their orders were to hold the yard for as long as the demolition took, and none of them expected to hold it for long. Ronneberg's 4-man demolition party split into pairs and went for the basement. The plans smuggled out of Norway by scientists inside the plant had marked a cellar door as the entry point. It was locked. A second door was locked. The building that had to fall that night was sealed against them at every obvious point, and every minute spent in the lit yard raised the odds that a sentry's boredom would end the war's most important raid with a single shout. Then Ronneberg found the flaw the defenders had never rated as a threat. A cable duct, a cramped shaft packed with pipes and wiring that ran through the foundation into the basement itself, exactly where an exiled Norwegian scientist in Britain had told the planners to look. Ronneberg went in first, flat on his stomach, pushing his pack of explosives ahead of him through the dark, steel brushing his shoulders on both sides. 1 man followed. The other pair, cut off in the shuffle outside, would have to find their own way in. The duct ran 40 yards through the guts of the building, and it ended at an opening above a room washed in electric light. And below them stood the 18 high-concentration cells of the world's only industrial heavy water plant, arranged in 2 gleaming rows, unguarded. 1 Norwegian caretaker sat with his paperwork among the cells. He was 60 years old, and when 2 armed men dropped out of the ceiling cavity, he raised his hands and made no sound at all. The demolition men worked with a speed that came from months of rehearsal on a full-scale mock-up in Britain. Ronneberg drew the charges, sausages of plastic explosives shaped to wrap the base of each steel cell, and moved down the row, fitting them one after another while his partner covered the door and the caretaker. Halfway through the work, glass shattered behind them. Both men spun with weapons raised at a window breaking inward, and framed in it were the other 2 members of the demolition team, who had failed to find the duct, chosen the direct approach, and climbed in through the basement window instead. The 4 of them finished the row together. 18 charges on 18 cells, coupled fuses laid, and here Ronneberg made a decision on the spot that defined the operation's discipline. The plan specified 2-minute fuses. He cut them down to 30 seconds. 2 minutes gave the Germans time to find and tear the charges free if the alarm sounded early. 30 seconds guaranteed the destruction, and guaranteed that the demolition party would be barely clear of the building, still inside the compound, when their own explosives went off. The elderly caretaker suddenly begged for a delay of a different kind, gesturing frantically until they understood. His eyeglasses were in the room, nearly irreplaceable in wartime Norway, and he could not work without them. With the fate of the atomic age balanced on a 30-second fuse, the raiders paused, found the man's glasses, handed them over, walked him up the stairs, told him to run, lit the fuses, and went out the cellar door at speed. The explosion, when it came, was almost an anticlimax. A flat, muffled thump, swallowed by the mountain walls and the endless roar of the generators. A sound the sentries had heard 100 times before from the ice cracking in the gorge or machinery venting inside the plant. In the basement, the thump was the sound of the German atomic program hemorrhaging. All 18 cells were torn open, and roughly 1,000 pounds of heavy water, the accumulated output of months of production and years of refinement, ran out across the concrete floor and down the drains, mixed with the water flooding from the shattered cooling systems. Nearly half a ton of the most strategically precious liquid on Earth vanished into the sewers of a Norwegian mountainside in under a minute. Outside in the yard, the raiders froze in the shadows as a single German soldier emerged from the barracks, unarmed, carrying a flashlight. He swept the beam across the snow, across the ground where Hawkelid's men lay with fingers on triggers, paused, found nothing worth the cold and went back inside. The door closed. The 10 men slipped through the railway gate and were gone into the gorge before the garrison understood that anything at all had happened. The descent that had taken careful hours in the approach now happened in minutes, a barely controlled plunge down through the scrub toward the river. Because behind them the alarm finally rose, sirens climbing over the valley as the plant staff found the wreckage in the basement. The ice bridge was still there. It was awash, groaning, hours from dissolving, and 10 men crossed it at intervals with the sirens echoing off the gorge walls above them, then threw themselves at the far slope, 500 feet of climbing on muscles already spent, while headlights began to move on the road across the valley. They reached their cache skis at the top, as the German response machine came fully awake below. And then the Hardingerwitte did for them what it had done to the glider force in November. It closed around them, vast, white and trackless, except that these 10 men were creatures of that country, and the storm that rolled in behind them erased their trail as cleanly as if the mountain itself had chosen a side. General von Falkenhorst arrived at Vemork the next morning and walked the basement personally. He found the shattered cells, the empty compound, the cut chain, the impossible route out of the gorge, and no evidence of a single shot fired. Confronted with a raid of such economy that not one man on either side had been killed, the general who had ordered wounded prisoners murdered 15 weeks earlier delivered his verdict to his own staff, calling it the finest coup he had seen in the war. And then he began punishing everyone within reach. The plant's German security chief was relieved. Suspicion fell on the Norwegian workforce. 12,000 German troops, aircraft and ski patrols swept onto the Hardingerwitte in the largest manhunt of the occupation, and they found nothing, because the raiding party had already split according to plan. 5 men, Ronneberg among them, skied 250 miles across occupied Norway to the Swedish border in 14 days, in uniform, through the middle of the search, and crossed to neutral ground without firing a shot. The others dispersed into the mountains and the resistance. Every single member of the operation survived. The mission was a total tactical success, and the villain's program refused to die. Falkenhorst's engineers and the German scientific administration threw resources at the wreckage. And here the story turned on the brutal arithmetic of industrial war. The cells were rebuilt faster than London believed possible. By April of 1943, production was restarting. By summer, the plant was concentrating heavy water again, and the shipments to the Reich resumed. In November of 1943, the Americans answered with the blunt instrument the commandos had been sent to avoid. 143 B-17 bombers over Arjukin in daylight. More than 700 bombs against the plant that 6 men had penetrated with hand charges. The bombs killed 21 Norwegian civilians, and the basement heavy water plant, buried under 7 floors of concrete and steel, survived almost untouched. The raid Ronneberg had executed without a single casualty had done more damage than the entire 8th Air Force strike, and the comparison was not lost on either government. But the bombing convinced Berlin of one thing: Vemork was no longer tenable, and in February of 1944, the Germans ordered the entire remaining stock of heavy water, every drum and canister down to the dregs, drained and shipped to Germany, to continue the reactor program on safer ground. One man was still in position to stop it, and he had been living in the mountains above Arjukin for a year. Nut Hawkelid, who had led the covering party at the plant gate, received the intelligence from workers inside Vemork. The heavy water would travel by rail to a lake ferry called the Hydro, cross Lake Tyn on the morning of Sunday, February 20th, 1944, and from there run to the coast for shipment to Germany. The rail line was guarded. The port would be guarded. The single unguarded link in the chain was the ferry itself, a civilian vessel that carried local passengers, and Hawkelid's superiors in London confirmed the order with full knowledge of what it meant. On the Saturday night, Hawkelid and 2 others walked aboard the docked ferry, told a curious watchman they were fugitives hiding from the Germans, and were left alone. In the bilge below the waterline, Hawkelid laid 19 pounds of plastic explosive in a ring and wired it to 2 alarm clock timers, set for the moment the ship would be over the deepest part of the lake. On Sunday morning, the Hydro sailed on schedule with the drums of heavy water lashed on deck and 53 people aboard. At 10:45, the charge blew the bow open, and the ferry went down in minutes over 1,300 feet of water, taking the drums to the bottom, and taking 14 Norwegian civilians and 4 German soldiers with it. Hawkelid had arranged for resistance contacts to quietly encourage people off that particular sailing, but he had known there would be dead, and he carried that arithmetic for the rest of his life, alongside the fact that the German nuclear program never received another liter of Norwegian heavy water. That was the end of it. Not one route remained. The German reactor experiments limped on with what stock had already reached the Reich, always short of moderator, always below the threshold, where a chain reaction became a weapons program. And when Allied intelligence teams overran the final German laboratory in a cave in southern Germany in April of 1945, they found a reactor that had never once gone critical. The scientists were captured, the uranium was seized, and the fear that had driven every man down into the Vemork Gorge was formally laid to rest. Hitler's bomb had died of thirst, and the drought began on a February night in 1943. Falkenhorst, the general who had fortified Vemork and enforced the commando order, was tried after the war for the murder of the glider prisoners, sentenced to death, and spared into a prison term instead, his name surviving in the record chiefly as the man whose impregnable fortress was opened with a pair of bolt cutters and a cable duct. Ronneberg went home to Alessand, spent his life refusing to call himself a hero, and outlived every other man on the raid, dying in 2018 at the age of 99. The operation he led is studied to this day as something close to the perfect special forces mission. 11 men against a garrison fortress and the physics of a world war, 1,000 pounds of heavy water destroyed, and not a single shot fired on the objective. The gorge below Vemork is quiet now. The plant still stands on its ledge above Arjuken, a museum where the cells once dripped, and the story it preserves is the simplest and hardest lesson of that entire war. The atomic age was decided not only in laboratories and bomber fleets, but by a handful of men on skis, alone on a frozen plateau, who climbed down into the dark carrying everything they needed on their backs. The 10 men who slipped through the railway gate that night were skiing into the largest manhunt the German occupation of Norway ever mounted, and none of them yet knew its scale. Within 48 hours of Falkenhorst's inspection of the wrecked basement, close to 12,000 German soldiers were moving onto the Hardingervidda and into the valleys that ringed it. Reconnaissance aircraft crossed the plateau in grids during every hour of daylight. Ski companies pushed out from the roadheads in long files, checking every hunting cabin, every boathouse, every farm within reach of Arjuken. Roadblocks sealed the valleys. In the town itself, the Gestapo began pulling in Norwegian workers from the plant, because Falkenhorst's own conclusion cut two ways. The raid had been executed by soldiers in British uniform, which spared the local population from formal reprisal. But somebody had fed those soldiers the plans of the building, and the search for that somebody would run for the rest of the war. Out on the plateau, the raiding party had already ceased to exist as a single unit. The plan had always ended with dispersal, because 10 men leave a trail that 12,000 can find, while ones and twos vanish. 5 men under Ronneberg turned east within hours of the attack, and committed themselves to the longest option on the map, a crossing of nearly 250 miles of occupied Norway to the Swedish frontier, on skis, in uniform, carrying weapons, through the middle of winter and the middle of the search. They moved by night at first, then by day when the terrain emptied, navigating from summit to summit across country where a broken binding or a wrong bearing meant death by exposure long before any patrol arrived. The storm that had covered their escape from the gorge returned in waves through the first week, and the 5 men learned to treat it as an ally that charged a toll, burrowing into the snow when it blew hardest, moving hard in the clear windows between fronts. They crossed roads at a sprint in the dark between German motor patrols. They skirted villages by miles. On the 14th day, they crossed a frozen border river into Sweden, walked into internment as uniformed soldiers of the exiled Norwegian forces, and were quietly processed back to Britain, where Ronneberg reported the destruction of the cells with the flat brevity of a man filing paperwork. The other 5 stayed inside the trap, and the trap closed hardest on the men least equipped to survive it. Two of the raiders skied west toward the coast and slipped into the civilian underground. Hawkelid and one companion turned deeper into the Hardingervidda itself, gambling that the Germans would search the edges of the plateau before they searched its dead interior. And the gamble held. For weeks the two men lived as the grouse team had lived before them, in huts and snow holes, on reindeer and hoarded rations, watching German ski patrols move like beads on the white horizon, and letting the distance do the fighting. One patrol came close enough that the outcome turned on a frozen lake, and a head start measured in minutes. The Germans found huts with warm stoves and empty bunks. They found ski tracks that storms had half erased, and that led onto ice and ended. By April, the search was consuming battalions that the Eastern Front needed more, and the German command scaled it back, satisfied that the raiders had either escaped or died on the plateau. Hawkelid was still there. He had orders now that reached beyond the raid: stay in the mountains, rebuild the local resistance networks, and watch Vemork, because London already suspected that the story was not finished. The suspicion was correct within weeks. The cells were simpler to rebuild than anyone in Britain had wanted to believe, and by the summer of 1943, the basement at Vemork was producing again, under heavier guard, behind new wire, with the cable duct sealed and the gorge approaches mined. The intelligence flowed out through the plant's Norwegian engineers to Hawkelid's couriers, and on to London. And the response, when it came in November, arrived at 25,000 feet. The American daylight raid put more than 700 bombs into the valley in minutes. The concussions rolled up the gorge like artillery. Smoke stood over Arjukin for hours, and when it cleared, the power station's upper floors were wrecked. The town had buried 21 of its own people, including patients in a shelter that took a direct hit, and the concrete over the basement had held. The heavy water plant itself came through the heaviest air attack in Norway's war essentially intact. The Norwegian government in exile protested the bombing to London and Washington in the sharpest language of the alliance, and in Berlin the calculation finally tipped. The site was too exposed to keep and too valuable to abandon, so the program would move, and the remaining heavy water would move with it. That decision traveled from Berlin to Arjukin in January of 1944, and it reached Hawkelid through a plant engineer within days. The stock was smaller than it sounded and more dangerous than it looked. Roughly 600 kilograms of heavy water spread through dozens of drums of varying concentration, the distilled remainder of the entire Norwegian program. Once it reached Germany, it would disappear into guarded laboratories beyond the reach of any raid. Hawkelid walked the route in his mind the way Ronneberg had walked the gorge. The rail line down the valley ran under guard. The transshipment points would crawl with troops for the transfer. The sea leg would sail under escort. Every hardened link pointed at the soft one, the Lake Ferry Hydro, which would carry the rail cars across Lake Tyn on a scheduled civilian sailing. And the choice it forced was the cruelest of his war. The ferry would carry passengers, Norwegian passengers, neighbors of the men planting the charge. Hawkelid sent the question to London and received the answer soldiers receive. The cargo justified the operation. He set the attack for the Sunday morning sailing, when the manifest would be lightest, and arranged through resistance contacts to thin the passenger list without explaining why. A whisper here, a delayed errand there, small interventions that could save individuals without alerting the Germans that the sailing was marked. On the Saturday night before the crossing, 3 men walked onto the docked ferry carrying a violin case and a bag that held 19 pounds of plastic explosive shaped into a ring. A watchman met them below decks. Hawkelid told him they were on the run from the Gestapo and needed a place to hide. And the man, like hundreds of Norwegians in those years, chose not to see what he was seeing and left them to it. In the bilge, lying in inches of freezing water under the passenger deck, Hawkelid laid the charge against the hull plating at the bow and wired it to 2 modified alarm clocks, building in redundancy because a misfire would hand the Germans their cargo and a warning at the same time. The timers were set for 10:45, the point on the schedule when the Hydra would stand over the deepest sounding in the lake, more than 1,300 feet of black water. The three men were gone before dawn. On Sunday morning, the railcars rolled aboard, the drums lashed and guarded, 53 people took passage, and the ferry cleared the pier on time. At 10:45, the bow blew open. The lake came in faster than the boats could be worked, and the Hydro went down by the head in minutes, spilling railcars, drums, and people into water cold enough to kill in minutes more. 26 survivors were pulled out by local boats. 18 people died, 14 of them Norwegian civilians, and the drums of heavy water went to the bottom of Lake Tinn, beyond salvage, beyond Germany, beyond the war. Haukelid crossed into Sweden days later, with the Gestapo working backward through the sailing's manifest, and the German atomic program absorbed its final logistics report. Total stock lost, source destroyed, no replacement available at any price. What remained after that was epilogue, and the epilogue ran long. The German reactor group consolidated its surviving material in the south of the Reich and kept working to the end. And the end came in April of 1945 in a Bavarian cave, where an Allied scientific intelligence team found a reactor assembly that had never sustained a chain reaction, and scientists who had never possessed enough moderator to force the issue. The interrogations that followed settled the question that had justified every risk on the Hardingervidda. The program had been years behind the Americans, starved of priority, starved of uranium, and starved above all of heavy water, and the starvation had a date of onset. Falkenhorst faced a British military court in 1946 for the murders committed under the Commando order, heard a death sentence, and saw it commuted. He died in West Germany in 1968. Paulsen, Haukelid, and Ronneberg carried their decorations home to a country that took decades to learn the full story. And in 2005, a research expedition put a submersible down onto the bed of Lake Tinn and brought up one of the Hydro's drums from the darkness where it had rested for 61 years. The analysis confirmed the concentration records and closed the file. The heavy water was exactly what the intelligence had claimed, and it had never moved an inch toward Germany. The drum sits in a museum now, a few miles from the gorge, corroded and mute. The last physical witness to the night 11 men on skis decided who would build the atomic bomb. The road to the gorge began not with soldiers, but with a telephone call that never happened the way the Germans needed it to. In the spring of 1940, within weeks of the invasion of Norway, German scientific administrators arrived at Vemork with an order for Norsk Hydro, the plant's owner. Increase heavy water production by an order of magnitude. Immediately, price no object. The demand itself was the leak. Before the war, heavy water had been a laboratory curiosity, sold by the leader to physicists studying the atomic nucleus, and the only customers who had ever wanted it in quantity were the French scientists racing Germany toward a chain reaction. Now Berlin wanted tons. The plant's Norwegian managers understood exactly what that appetite meant, and one of them, a chief engineer named Hjalmar Brunn, began the quiet double life that would define the target for the men who came later. Brunn supervised the production the Germans demanded and photographed it. He copied drawings of the basement, the cells, the ducts, and the doors. He recorded concentrations, output rates, and shipment schedules, and the material moved out of occupied Norway hidden in toothpaste tubes and courier luggage, through Sweden, to a desk in London, where exiled Norwegian scientists assembled it into something no bomber photograph could provide, a map of the building's bloodstream, drawn by the men who ran it. Norwegian workers slowed the program from inside long before any commando arrived. Batches were quietly spoiled with additives that wrecked the electrolysis. Equipment failed in ways that took weeks to trace. The Germans responded with deadlines and threats. Production crept upward anyway, and by 1942, the London files held two facts that could not coexist. The German nuclear program was real, and its single most irreplaceable input flowed from one basement in Telemark. In the autumn of 1942, Brunn himself was extracted to Britain, and the planners could now interrogate the plant's own chief engineer across a table. It was Brunn's knowledge that killed the idea of sabotage by air alone, because he could tell them precisely how little of the plant's mass mattered, 18 cells in a shielded basement, and how much Norwegian blood surrounded it in the town below. It was his knowledge, joined to that of an exiled professor named Leif Tronstad, who had helped design the heavy water process itself, that identified the cable duct through the foundation. Tronstad briefed the raiders in Britain with a sentence that outlived the war, telling them they could not be told why the target mattered so much, only that if they succeeded it would live in Norway's memory for 100 years. The men trained on that promise and on a full-scale wooden mock-up of the basement, built from Brunn's drawings, until each of them could find every cell, every valve, and every door with their eyes closed, because the plan assumed they might have to do exactly that. The rehearsals were run against a clock and against darkness, and they were run by men who had already buried the first attempt. The glider disaster of November 1942 had taught the planners a full curriculum in a single night. That towing engineers over the North Sea in winter handed the mission to the weather. That heavy equipment was a liability in mountains that punished every extra pound. And that survival on the Hardangervidda was itself a military skill possessed by almost no one outside Norway. So the gunnerside six were stripped down to what six backs could carry and drilled past the point of thought. They practiced the charge placement until the full set of 18 went on in minutes. They test-fired weapons at 40 below to learn which oils froze. They jumped, skied, climbed, and starved on exercises in the Scottish hills. And they memorized the cover story and the geography of a route to Sweden they hoped never to need. Each man was told what the capsule in his pocket was for. Each man signed for it. The mission's arithmetic was explained without decoration. The target justified the operation. The operation did not justify rescue, and a wounded man's last duty was silence. While they trained, the 4 men of Grouse were conducting the war's loneliest holding action, and the details of that winter deserve more space than the timeline gave them. Paulsen's team had jumped in October, expecting to guide gliders in and walk out within weeks, and instead the crash marooned them on the plateau with winter closing and London's order to remain. Their radio, the mission's entire reason for existing, ran on batteries that died in the cold, and the operator, a methodical sergeant named Nut Hogland, rebuilt his power supply from scavenged parts and kept the link to Britain alive from a hut in a frozen wilderness, tapping out weather reports that would eventually time the gunnerside drop. Food was the second war. The team's rations were calculated in days, and the wait ran into months, and the men's bodies went through the stages the manuals described with clinical detachment. Fat first, then muscle, then judgment. They fell asleep mid-sentence. Fingers split and would not heal. When Paulsen finally brought down the first reindeer just before Christmas, the 4 of them ate it in the old way because the old way was the correct chemistry, and the meat pulled them back from an edge they had been sliding toward for weeks. They were still keeping watch schedules. Through all of it, frostbitten and hallucinating, they logged German garrison changes at Vemork and passed them to London, so that when Ronneberg's team finally arrived in February, the assault plan rested on 4 months of observation paid for in the observer's own tissue. The meeting of the 2 teams on the plateau joined the mission's halves, the fresh strength and the hard-won knowledge, and one more piece of intelligence sealed the plan in the final days. A Norwegian contact in the valley confirmed what the aerial photographs had suggested about the gorge, that its far wall carried enough vegetation to climb, and confirmed something the photographs could not show: the rhythm of the garrison, the guard change at midnight, the sentry's habit of avoiding the yard in deep cold, the fact that the suspension bridge watch faced the road and not the ravine at its back. Falkenhorst's fortifications, laid out in November against the attack the last raid had telegraphed, all faced the directions from which a rational enemy would come. The mines watched the mountain. The machine guns watched the bridge. The floodlights washed the approaches that mattered, and the gorge below hummed on in the dark, unwatched, because the men who had certified it impossible had never grown up on skis. That was the seam the whole operation drove through, and it is why the raid is taught the way it is taught. Not as a story of courage overwhelming firepower, though the courage was real, but as a story of intelligence, patience, and local knowledge, finding the one assumption a fortress rests on and pulling it out. Everything after that, the duct, the 30-second fuses, the caretaker's glasses, the flat thump under the generator's roar, followed from 4 months of watching, and 2 years of engineers' drawings smuggled out in toothpaste tubes. The Germans rebuilt the cells, and the Allies bombed the valley, and the ferry went to the bottom of Lake Tyn. But the decisive act remained the quiet one: 18 charges laid by men who knew the room better than its guards did, in a basement mapped by the patriots who built it. The war ended for the heavy water program in a Bavarian cave, but it did not end for the men who had fought over it, and their afterlives scattered across the century like fragments from the same detonation. Nut Hogland, the radio operator who had kept the link alive through the starvation winter, came out of the war looking for a quieter kind of impossible, and found it in 1947 on a balsa raft called the Kon-Tiki, crossing 4,300 miles of open Pacific with Thor Heyerdahl. Once again, the man responsible for keeping a failing radio alive in a place where no rescue could reach. Jens Anton Paulsen, who had shot the reindeer that kept his team breathing, stayed in uniform and rose to colonel in the post-war Norwegian army, and for the rest of his life, he answered questions about the plateau with the same understatement he had used in his wartime reports. Nut Hogland returned home carrying both the medal and the manifest, the 18 names from the hydro, and he addressed it the only way the men of that generation did, plainly in a memoir that stated the choice, stated the order, and declined to ask the reader for absolution. He too served out a career in the army of the country he had helped keep out of the atomic story. And Joachim Ronneberg went back to Alessand and became a radio journalist. And for 50 years, he barely spoke of the raid at all, until age thinned the ranks around him, and he understood that silence had a cost of its own. In his last decades, he traveled to schools and military academies, and told the story in the dry, exact voice of a man reading a route card. And when he died in October of 2018 at 99, prime ministers and defense chiefs stood at his funeral, and the obituaries in 3 languages used the same phrase the British had used in 1943, calling gunnercide the most successful act of sabotage of the Second World War. The Norwegians inside the plant paid their own price on a different schedule. Hjalmar Brunn, the chief engineer whose toothpaste tubes had carried the basement to London, lived out the war in Britain, advising the Allied atomic intelligence effort, and returned afterward to a career in the same Norwegian industry he had spent 3 years quietly betraying to save. Others were less shielded. In the reprisals and suspicion that followed the raid and the bombing, workers were arrested, interrogated, and deported, and the town of Arjuken carried its 21 dead from the November air raid alongside the 14 from the ferry, a double grief inflicted by its liberators. And the town's memory of the war has always been more complicated than the medal's citations, holding pride and mourning in the same hand. That complication reached into the alliance itself. The Norwegian government's protest over the bombing became part of the post-war argument about how occupied allies should be consulted before their towns were struck, and the Vemork case was cited for decades as the demonstration that 6 men with rucksacks had achieved what 143 bombers could not, at a cost of 0 lives against 35. On the German side, the reckoning was quieter and stranger. The 10 leading physicists of the reactor program, Werner Heisenberg among them, were captured in the spring of 1945 and interned in an English country house called Farm Hall, where hidden microphones recorded their conversations, and the transcripts caught the moment in August when the news of Hiroshima reached them. The recordings preserved disbelief, then recalculation, then the beginning of the story the German scientists would tell for the rest of their lives, that they had never truly tried to build the weapon, and historians have spent 80 years weighing that claim against the procurement orders, the heavy water demands, and the priority fights the documents actually show. What the documents show without ambiguity is the constraint. The German program had chosen heavy water as its moderator path in 1940, had rejected graphite on the basis of a flawed purity measurement it never revisited, and had thereby chained its entire reactor effort to a single basement in Telemark. Every liter lost in February of 1943, every month of rebuilding, every drum on the bottom of Lake Tin subtracted directly from the only path Berlin was funding, and the program that Allied planners had feared in 1942 was found in 1945 to be a laboratory effort years from criticality, let alone a weapon. The fear had been rational, the response proportionate, and the outcome exactly what Tronstad had promised the raiders without being able to explain it. Falkenhorst's file closed in stages. The court that tried him in 1946 for the murders of the glider prisoners heard the evidence of the commando order applied to wounded men in Norwegian cells, sentenced him to death by firing squad, and then the sentence was commuted to 20 years, and in 1953 he was released on grounds of health into a West German retirement that lasted another 15 years. The men his order had killed were reburied with honors, and the investigation into their deaths, run in part by the same Norwegian officers who had fought the secret war, became one of the early templates for how war crimes against special forces would be prosecuted. The commando order itself was cited at Nuremberg as a criminal order per se, and officers far senior to Falkenhorst answered for it. The physical remains of the story settled into museums and lake mud. Vemork's power station became the Norwegian Industrial Workers Museum, and in 2017, archaeologists excavated the demolished basement itself, 60 years after the building above it had been torn down, and found the room the raiders had crawled into, the concrete scarred where the cells had stood, and artifacts of the night still in place. The drum raised from Lake Tin in 2005 went on display with its contents verified. The cabin routes across the Hardangervidda became a marked memorial trail that thousands ski every winter in the raiders' tracks, most of them in modern gear, in daylight, in good weather. And the trail's guides like to note that even so, the plateau turns people back every year. The raid itself became the rare military story that fiction kept getting wrong in the same direction, the films adding gunfights the night never contained. Because the truth, 11 men, one broken chain, 30 seconds of fuse, and not a shot fired at the objective, kept striking screenwriters as insufficiently dramatic. The men who were there always insisted the opposite. The drama, they said, was the silence, the months of it on the plateau, and the minutes of it in the basement, and the sound the war never heard. A muffled thump under a generator's roar. In a gorge the enemy had certified impossible. On the night the atomic age quietly chose its owner.